They say I was born. I, of course, have no direct recollection of this event, which seems a rather significant oversight in the grand design of human consciousness. One might expect a flash of insight, a sudden understanding of one's own arrival, perhaps a brief existential musing on the nature of being. Instead, there was merely a rather abrupt transition from non-existence to a state of profound, albeit temporary, helplessness. It was, I imagine, much like opening a particularly challenging jar of pickles, only to find oneself suddenly embodying the pickle. A curious paradigm shift, to be sure. My initial moments, as recounted by those who were present and presumably more lucid, involved a certain degree of consternation. Not on my part, naturally, as I was quite preoccupied with the basic mechanics of respiration, which, I must confess, seemed an unnecessarily convoluted process at the time. The consternation was directed at my rather unusually shaped head, a feature that apparently caused some alarm. One might even say it was a head that promised to redefine the very concept of cranial aesthetics, much like a particularly ambitious but ultimately flawed architectural blueprint. It was less a head and more a philosophical statement, delivered without preamble. My parents, Herman and Pauline, were, I gather, reasonably conventional individuals. Herman, a man of practical endeavors, dealt in electrical equipment. One could say he was in the business of illuminating the mundane, a stark contrast to my own later pursuits of illuminating the cosmic. Pauline, my mother, was by all accounts a more domestically inclined figure, though I suspect she harbored a secret desire to organize the world's socks by molecular structure. Their union was, I presume, a standard arrangement devoid of the dramatic flair one might expect from the progenitors of someone who would later ponder the curvature of space-time. There were no celestial choirs, no omens of impending intellectual earthquakes. Just two people, a house, and an increasing inventory of electrical conduits. My sister Maya arrived some 2 years after me. Her presence introduced a new dynamic into the household, primarily involving the redistribution of toys and the occasional, highly strategic deployment of minor annoyances. Siblings, I have observed, are rather like minor gravitational anomalies within a family unit, constantly tugging and pulling, occasionally causing objects to collide in unexpected ways. Maya, in her own understated fashion, was a stable, reassuring presence, much like a well-calibrated pendulum, perpetually swinging with predictable regularity, even when the world around it was engaged in a particularly frantic jig. Our early life was spent in Ulm, a town whose primary claim to fame, aside from my rather unceremonious entry into the world within its confines, was its impressive minster, a truly formidable structure, built with a dedication to verticality that bordered on the obsessive. One could spend a lifetime contemplating its spires, and indeed, many did, presumably without reaching any particularly profound conclusions about the nature of existence, beyond the rather obvious one that stone, when stacked correctly, can defy gravity for quite some time. Then came Munich. Munich, with its beer halls and its rather enthusiastic embrace of the concept of Gemütlichkeit, which, to my young, developing mind, seemed to translate roughly as the pervasive sensation of being gently suffocated by good cheer and fermented grains. My father's business ventures had led us there, a move that, while seemingly innocuous at the time, would in hindsight prove to be a crucial inflection point in my intellectual trajectory. One might even describe it as the subtle shifting of tectonic plates beneath the very foundation of my consciousness, though without the accompanying geological drama of actual tremors or the unfortunate collapse of local infrastructure. It was more of a quiet, almost imperceptible slide into a new postal code. My schooling began, as it often does, with a rather bewildering introduction to the structured dissemination of information. The Luitpold Gymnasium was by all accounts a reputable institution, though its methods sometimes felt less like education and more like a concerted effort to drain the very essence of curiosity from young minds, replacing it with a standardized, easily quantifiable sludge of facts. The emphasis, it seemed, was on rote memorization and unquestioning acceptance rather than the playful deconstruction of established paradigms. It was an environment designed to produce well-behaved cogs, not, as it turned out, particularly well-behaved questioners of the very fabric of reality. The teachers, bless their earnest hearts, were like enthusiastic gardeners attempting to cultivate bonsai trees with a sledgehammer. The results, while certainly contained, often lacked a certain organic exuberance. One particular incident stands out, not for its dramatic impact, but for its rather mundane illumination of the prevailing pedagogical philosophy. I recall a lesson on the various types of cloud formations. The instructor, a man whose enthusiasm for meteorology was matched only by his complete lack of discernible humor, meticulously listed the Latin names and characteristics of cirrus, cumulus, and stratus. He then proceeded to test our recall, demanding precise definitions. When I ventured a rather speculative observation about the aesthetic qualities of a particularly fluffy cumulus cloud resembling a giant slumbering badger, I was met with a gaze that could curdle milk. The badger, it was made clear, was not on the syllabus. Knowledge, it seemed, was to be consumed, not creatively reinterpreted. It was a clear demonstration that in the realm of formal education, the pursuit of truth often took a back seat to the pursuit of accurate nomenclature. The compass. Ah, the compass. A small, unassuming device, yet its impact on my nascent intellect was disproportionately profound. Like a pebble dropped into a vast, unruffled pond, the ripples of which would eventually encompass the entirety of the universe. My father presented it to me when I was 5, a gift that in its subtle elegance seemed to whisper secrets of an unseen order. The needle relentlessly pointing north, irrespective of my own orientation, was a phenomenon that defied immediate intuitive explanation. It was a stubborn, silent oracle, hinting at forces beyond the grasp of my limited preschool understanding. The simple instrument was, for me, a tiny metallic gateway to a realm of invisible forces. How did it know? What unseen hand guided its unwavering direction? It was a question that lodged itself deep within my consciousness, like a particularly persistent splinter of curiosity. Most children, I imagine, would have simply accepted its function, perhaps used it to locate buried pirate treasure in the sandbox, or to determine the precise trajectory of a dropped cookie. But for me, it was a profound mystery, a miniature cosmic anomaly that sat comfortably in the palm of my hand. It was the first tangible evidence that the world was not merely a collection of visible objects, but a swirling, interconnected tapestry of unseen influences, much like a particularly intricate spiderweb spun by a mathematically inclined arachnid. This fascination with the unseen led me, naturally, to a certain detachment from the more boisterous pursuits of my peers. While they were engaged in the vigorous pursuit of dirt clods and the strategic deployment of sticks, I was often found staring into space, or, more accurately, staring at space, attempting to discern the invisible threads that bound everything together. My social interactions, therefore, were sometimes less about shared play and more about shared silence, punctuated by my occasional, unsolicited observations about the peculiar way light refracted through a dusty window pane. One might say I was an early adopter of the contemplative loner aesthetic, long before it became fashionable among angsty poets and disgruntled baristas. My family, bless their patient souls, largely tolerated this nascent eccentricity. My mother, I believe, viewed it as a harmless, if slightly puzzling, phase, much like a temporary obsession with collecting interesting pebbles. My father, with his more practical bent, likely saw it as an unproductive, though not entirely detrimental, use of mental energy. They were, in essence, witnesses to the quiet germination of a mind that would eventually produce theories so outlandish, so utterly contrary to common sense, that they would require entirely new vocabularies to describe, all stemming, in essence, from a tiny, magnetic needle. It was, in retrospect, a rather subtle way for the universe to telegraph its intentions. The violin. My mother, in a gesture that I can only assume was born of a desire to cultivate a certain cultural refinement, insisted I learn to play the violin. Music, she reasoned, was a civilizing force, a balm for the restless soul. I, however, found it to be more of a relentless, high-pitched assault on the ears, particularly in the initial stages of instruction. The sounds I produced were less melodious and more akin to the dying cries of a particularly disgruntled cat being serenaded by a rusty gate. It was not, shall we say, an immediate love affair. My early lessons were a testament to human perseverance, mostly my teacher's. He was a man of infinite patience, a quality I suspect he cultivated by spending long hours in the company of particularly stubborn root vegetables. Each note was a battle, each scale a miniature war. The bow, in my inexperienced hands, seemed to possess a mischievous sentience, determined to produce the most grating sounds imaginable. One could argue it was a form of avant-garde noise pollution, long before the concept was formally recognized. The irony, of course, is that I later came to appreciate the profound beauty and order inherent in musical harmony. A structure that, in many ways, mirrors the elegance of the physical laws governing the universe. But in those early days, it was merely an exercise in controlled sonic chaos. My family, during these practice sessions, developed a remarkable capacity for selective hearing. My father would suddenly become engrossed in the finer details of an electrical schematic, humming tunelessly to himself. My sister Maya would discover an urgent need to inspect the structural integrity of the ceiling. It was a silent collective acknowledgement that while music might be a civilizing force, my attempts at it were more likely to precipitate a mass exodus from the immediate vicinity. One might even describe it as a rudimentary form of social distancing, enacted long before such measures became a global necessity. Despite my initial aversion, or perhaps because of it, the violin eventually became a companion. A different kind of language through which to explore patterns and rhythms. It taught me about the interconnectedness of vibrations, the delicate balance between tension and release, the subtle interplay of forces that create something beautiful out of mere noise. It was a lesson in harmony, not just of notes, but of the underlying principles that govern all phenomena. Though I never achieved virtuoso status, my relationship with the violin evolved from one of mutual antagonism to a grudging, then eventually genuine appreciation. It was a reminder that sometimes the most profound insights are born from persistent, if initially agonizing, effort. Much like trying to understand the photoelectric effect, only with more screeching. The move to Italy, specifically Pavia, was an escape, a liberation from the rigid, authoritarian educational system that had begun to chafe at my burgeoning, albeit still somewhat unfocused, intellect. My father's business had faltered in Munich, a minor, though financially significant blip in the grand scheme of things. For me, it was an opportunity to shed the suffocating mantle of the German gymnasium, a place where conformity was celebrated and independent thought viewed with suspicion, much like a rogue dust bunny in an otherwise meticulously sanitized laboratory. Italy, in contrast, felt like a breath of fresh air, a sun-drenched landscape where ideas seemed to float more freely, unburdened by the oppressive weight of Prussian discipline. I was, for a time, reunited with my family, and the atmosphere was distinctly more relaxed. One might even say it was an environment conducive to the kind of meandering, unproductive thought that often precedes significant breakthroughs, much like a particularly fertile patch of intellectual compost. It was during this period that I truly began to explore ideas independently, to follow the winding paths of my own curiosity without the constant threat of a red pen or the disapproving gaze of a stern, humorless instructor. However, this idyllic interlude was not to last. My parents, practical individuals concerned with my future prospects, insisted that I complete my education. The chosen destination was the Swiss Federal Polytechnic in Zurich, or the ETH as it was more commonly known. The prospect of further formal schooling was at best met with a sigh of resignation, at worst, a mild internal groan. It felt rather like being politely but firmly ushered back into a slightly less stifling, but still undeniably enclosed, intellectual space after a brief, exhilarating sprint across an open field. My application to the ETH, however, encountered a minor bureaucratic hurdle. I had not yet completed my Abitur, the German secondary school leaving certificate. This oversight, a minor detail in the grand scheme of things, necessitated a year of preparatory schooling in Aarau, Switzerland. Aarau was, by all accounts, a perfectly pleasant town, though its primary function in my life at that juncture was to serve as a temporary holding pen, a necessary waypoint on the path to what I hoped would be a more stimulating intellectual environment. The year was spent preparing for the entrance examination, a process that involved revisiting various subjects I had previously deemed entirely superfluous, such as the intricacies of botanical classification and the precise dates of various obscure European conflicts. It was a period of sustained, if unenthusiastic, academic purgatory. Finally, Zurich! The Swiss Federal Polytechnic, or ETH, was a different beast entirely from the rigid, uninspiring gymnasium I had left behind. Here, there was a palpable sense of intellectual freedom, a willingness to engage with ideas that extended beyond the rote memorization of established facts. It was a place where one could truly immerse oneself in the pursuit of knowledge, much like a particularly determined badger burrowing into a particularly interesting mound of scientific data. The air, quite literally, felt thinner, more charged with possibility. My chosen field of study was physics, a subject that, even then, seemed to hold the keys to unlocking the universe's most profound secrets. It was a decision driven by an insatiable curiosity about how things worked, not merely how they were described. Mathematics was, of course, an integral part of this pursuit, a language of unparalleled precision through which the universe communicated its fundamental truths. I found myself drawn to its elegant logic, its unforgiving clarity. If physics was the grand narrative, mathematics was the exquisite grammar that held it all together. A grammar that, when mastered, allowed one to compose symphonies of understanding. The lectures themselves were a mixed bag. Some professors were truly inspiring, their enthusiasm for their subjects infectious, much like a particularly virulent strain of intellectual curiosity. Others, however, delivered their material with all the emotional resonance of a discarded sock, their voices droning on in a monotone that could lull a particularly caffeinated owl to sleep. It was during these less stimulating sessions that my mind would often wander, embarking on solitary excursions into the wilder, unexplored territories of theoretical physics. I found myself questioning established principles, playing mental games with the very fabric of reality, much to the quiet amusement of my more conventionally minded peers. They were, in essence, witnesses to the silent birth of disruptive ideas, though they likely mistook it for mere daydreaming or, perhaps, an early onset of profound boredom. My social life during this period was, shall we say, understated. While others were engaged in the robust pursuit of social interaction and various forms of light-hearted revelry, I found myself increasingly drawn to the quiet companionship of books and the solitary contemplation of abstract concepts. My preferred form of recreation often involved long walks, during which I would mentally wrestle with the perplexing intricacies of electromagnetism or the rather unsettling implications of certain thermodynamic principles. It was not, I confess, the kind of vibrant social calendar that would make for particularly thrilling memoirs, unless one's idea of thrills involves the sudden, profound understanding of a differential equation. The more conventional aspects of university life, such as attending all lectures or adhering strictly to the prescribed curriculum, were, for me, more suggestions than rigid mandates. I found myself gravitating towards subjects that genuinely piqued my interest, often to the mild consternation of my professors. One might even say I approached the curriculum as a particularly discerning diner approaches a buffet, selecting only the most appealing intellectual morsels and largely ignoring the unappetizing or overly familiar offerings. This selective approach, while perhaps not conducive to stellar grades in every subject, allowed me to delve deeply into areas that truly resonated with my burgeoning scientific instincts. My primary focus became theoretical physics, a realm where one could build intricate models of the universe, with nothing but thought and the elegant tools of mathematics. It was a place where the imagination could run wild, constrained only by the cold, hard logic of numbers and the often unsettling implications of experimental data. I spent countless hours in the library, not merely consuming information but dissecting it, challenging it, and attempting to reconstruct it in new and more satisfying ways. The dusty shelves and the hushed atmosphere of the library became my personal intellectual playground, a place where I could engage in silent, yet intensely vigorous, debates with the greatest minds of history. The company of a few like-minded individuals, however, was a welcome antidote to the often solitary nature of theoretical contemplation. Mikhail Besso, a fellow student, became a close friend and intellectual sparring partner. Our conversations often extended late into the night, fueled by copious amounts of coffee and an insatiable desire to unravel the universe's most stubbornly guarded secrets. We would discuss everything from the nature of light to the perplexing behavior of subatomic particles, our arguments ranging from the mildly contentious to the vigorously enthusiastic. Much like two particularly determined squirrels attempting to crack a particularly stubborn nut of an idea. These exchanges were invaluable, providing a crucial sounding board for my often unconventional thoughts, and occasionally preventing me from venturing too far down a particularly unproductive intellectual rabbit hole. It was during these formative years that the seeds of my most radical ideas began to germinate, often in the quiet moments between lectures or during my solitary walks. The established understanding of space and time, for instance, began to feel inadequate. It was like trying to fit a multi-dimensional elephant into a two-dimensional shoebox. The universe, I suspected, was far more intricate, far more counterintuitive than the prevailing scientific dogma suggested. And so, the quiet, persistent work of dismantling and rebuilding the very framework of reality began, one seemingly innocuous thought experiment at a time. It was a process that, in retrospect, felt less like a conscious decision and more like an irresistible gravitational pull towards a deeper, more elegant truth. After graduating from the ETH, the immediate future presented itself with the unsettling clarity of a freshly polished mirror reflecting a slightly bewildered individual. My academic record, while not entirely disastrous, was not precisely stellar, a consequence, I suspect, of my rather idiosyncratic approach to formal education. One might say I had developed a robust immune system to conventional pedagogical methods. This meant that the immediate prospect of a comfortable academic post was, shall we say, a rather distant nebula in the intellectual firmament. The universe, it seemed, had a delightful sense of irony, delaying the direct application of my newfound knowledge to the rather mundane task of earning a living. And so, I found myself in the rather delightful, if slightly unexpected, embrace of the Swiss Patent Office in Bern, a position that, on the surface, seemed to offer little in the way of groundbreaking scientific inquiry. My duties primarily involved scrutinizing patent applications for new inventions, a task that required a meticulous attention to detail and a remarkable ability to discern genuine innovation from thinly veiled attempts to repackage existing concepts. It was, in essence, a daily exercise in distinguishing between truly novel ideas and mere variations on a theme, much like a particularly dedicated sommelier attempting to identify the subtle nuances between various types of tap water. This work, while seemingly mundane, proved to be an unexpected boon. The constant exposure to a diverse array of mechanical and electrical devices, the endless stream of ingenious and occasionally ludicrous inventions, forced me to think with remarkable clarity about the practical application of physical principles. It was a daily dose of applied physics, delivered in the most unassuming of packages. I would spend hours poring over diagrams of telegraph systems, designs for improved dynamos, and the occasional, truly baffling contraption whose purpose remained shrouded in an almost poetic obscurity. This immersion in the tangible world of invention, I believe, provided a crucial counterbalance to my more abstract theoretical pursuits. It was a reminder that even the most elegant mathematical formulations must, eventually, connect with the messy, unpredictable reality of the physical world. The office environment itself was, by and large, rather placid. The gentle hum of industry, the rustle of papers, the occasional polite cough, these were the ambient sounds of my professional life. My colleagues were, for the most part, earnest, diligent individuals, dedicated to the careful processing of intellectual property. Our conversations, when they occurred, often revolved around the minutiae of patent law, or the particular merits of a newly proposed clockwork mechanism. It was a calm, almost meditative existence, providing ample mental space for my mind to wander, to chew on the more intractable problems of physics in the quiet moments between evaluating the novelty of a new type of buttonhole. It was during these quiet, often elongated moments within the confines of the Bern Patent Office that the seeds of revolutionary thought truly began to blossom. The steady, rhythmic cadence of patent applications being processed seemed to create a curious kind of mental white noise, an ideal backdrop against which the most profound and audacious ideas could quietly unfurl. The mundane became the crucible for the extraordinary, much like a particularly fertile patch of soil yielding an unexpectedly robust crop of intellectual sunflowers. My thoughts, no longer constrained by the rigid structures of academic deadlines or the expectations of formal examinations, began to explore avenues that had previously seemed too speculative, too audacious, too utterly at odds with established scientific consensus. I found myself pondering the nature of light with an almost obsessive intensity. How did it propagate through space? What was its true character? Was it a wave, as the prevailing theory suggested, or something else entirely? The questions gnawed at me, much like a particularly persistent, yet intellectually stimulating, mosquito. One specific line of inquiry that consumed a considerable portion of my mental real estate involved the peculiar behavior of objects moving at very high speeds. The accepted wisdom, derived from the venerable Newtonian mechanics, seemed perfectly adequate for describing the trajectory of a falling apple or the predictable swing of a pendulum. But what about something moving at, or even near, the speed of light? The established framework began to fray at the edges, like a beloved but increasingly threadbare intellectual tapestry. There were inconsistencies, logical lacunae, subtle but unmistakable whispers of a deeper, more profound reality lurking beneath the surface of everyday experience. It was as if the universe was politely but firmly informing me that I'd been thinking about things all wrong. Much like a particularly patient tutor attempting to correct a fundamental misunderstanding of basic arithmetic. The concept of simultaneity, for instance, became a recurring intellectual phantom, haunting my thoughts during my lunch breaks and on my solitary walks home. Could two events truly be simultaneous for all observers, regardless of their relative motion? The more I contemplated this seemingly simple question, the more it began to unravel the very fabric of my understanding of time. It was a realization that felt less like a sudden epiphany and more like the slow, deliberate unpeeling of an onion, each layer revealing a new, equally perplexing, and ultimately mind-bending truth. And all of this contemplation occurred amidst the comforting, if slightly monotonous, backdrop of assessing the originality of a newly designed bicycle spoke. The universe, it seemed, was perfectly content to reveal its deepest secrets to an individual engaged in the bureaucratic minutiae of intellectual property. The year 1905, often referred to with a certain reverence as my annus mirabilis, or miracle year, was less a sudden explosion of genius and more the quiet, methodical culmination of years of persistent, often solitary, intellectual excavation. It was a period during which several disparate strands of thought, previously existing as isolated intellectual curiosities, suddenly coalesced into a coherent, remarkably elegant tapestry. One might say it was the year my mental garden, having been tilled and fertilized with years of quiet contemplation, finally yielded a rather unexpected bounty of theoretical produce. The first significant paper, published in the Annalen der Physik, addressed the photoelectric effect. This rather peculiar phenomenon, wherein light striking certain metals causes electrons to be ejected, had stubbornly resisted explanation by classical physics. It was a perplexing anomaly, much like finding a perfectly spherical potato in a field of otherwise uniformly lumpy ones. My proposition, daringly, was that light, despite its well-established wave-like properties, also behaved as discrete packets of energy, which I later termed quanta. It was a concept so radical, so utterly counterintuitive, that it felt like suggesting that a particularly boisterous ocean wave was, in fact, composed of millions of tiny, invisible, perfectly formed bowling balls. The implications were, to put it mildly, profound, effectively laying the groundwork for what would eventually become quantum theory, a field that continues to baffle and delight scientists to this day. Then came the paper on Brownian motion, the seemingly erratic, jittery movement of particles suspended in a fluid. While others had observed this phenomenon, its underlying cause remained a mystery, much like the persistent disappearance of socks in a laundry dryer. My explanation, rooted in the idea of the random bombardment of these particles by unseen atoms and molecules, provided compelling evidence for the very existence of these microscopic entities. It was a subtle but undeniable triumph for atomic theory, transforming it from a mere hypothesis into a verifiable reality. One might even say it was the scientific equivalent of, finally, catching the sock thief in the act, red-handed and covered in lint. And, of course, the grand finale, the special theory of relativity. This was the culmination of my relentless wrestling with the nature of space, time, and the behavior of light. It proposed a radical departure from Newtonian mechanics, asserting that the laws of physics are the same for all non-accelerating observers, and that the speed of light in a vacuum is constant for all such observers, regardless of the motion of the light source. This seemingly innocuous assumption led to truly mind-bending consequences. Time dilation, length contraction, and the equivalence of mass and energy, famously encapsulated in the equation E equals mc squared. It was a paradigm shift so profound, so utterly contrary to everyday experience, that it felt like suddenly discovering that the very ground beneath your feet was not merely solid earth, but a particularly pliable trampoline. The universe, it seemed, was far more flexible, far more interconnected than anyone had previously dared to imagine. All of these monumental insights emerged from a modest desk in a patent office, surrounded by the quiet hum of bureaucratic diligence. The initial reception to these rather audacious pronouncements was, as one might expect, a rather curious mix of polite bewilderment, cautious skepticism, and the occasional, rather vocal dismissal. It was akin to presenting a particularly abstract piece of modern art to an audience accustomed solely to meticulously rendered pastoral landscapes. The immediate reaction was often a furrowed brow, followed by a hesitant question about the precise meaning of the brushstrokes. My theories, particularly special relativity, challenged deeply entrenched notions about the absolute nature of space and time, concepts that had been foundational to physics for centuries. To suggest that time itself could dilate, or that length could contract depending on one's relative motion, felt like an affront to common sense, an unwelcome intrusion of philosophical abstraction into the seemingly orderly realm of scientific observation. The scientific establishment, much like a particularly comfortable cat suddenly presented with a rather energetic and unconventional new chew toy, responded with a mixture of curiosity and a distinct reluctance to engage too vigorously. There were no riots in the streets, no dramatic public condemnations. Instead, there was a quiet, almost imperceptible shifting of intellectual furniture, as people attempted to make sense of these rather inconvenient truths. The language of physics, it seemed, needed to be relearned, or at least re-evaluated, in light of these new ideas. Concepts that had previously been considered immutable, such as simultaneity, were now revealed to be observer-dependent, much like the precise shade of a chameleon depending on its immediate surroundings. It was a humbling realization, suggesting that our intuitive understanding of the universe was, in fact, a rather limited and provincial affair. The universe, it seemed, did not care for our convenient approximations. It demanded a more rigorous, more imaginative, and ultimately more truthful description. My colleagues at the patent office, bless their practical souls, largely remained oblivious to the tectonic shifts occurring in the world of theoretical physics. Their concerns were, quite rightly, focused on the structural integrity of a new type of spring mechanism or the precise wiring of an improved electrical generator. While I was silently dismantling the very foundations of space-time, they were meticulously ensuring that the intellectual property of a particularly inventive tobacconist was adequately protected. This juxtaposition was in itself a source of quiet amusement, a subtle reminder of the vast chasm that often exists between the abstract world of pure thought and the tangible realities of everyday existence. The universe, it seemed, was quite content to reveal its deepest secrets to an individual who also happened to be an expert in the various applications of the internal combustion engine. Life in Bern, beyond the captivating intricacies of patent law and the occasional mental wrestling match with the ether, settled into a rhythm that, while not overtly dramatic, possessed its own quiet satisfactions. I married Mileva Maric, a former classmate from the ETH. Our courtship had been, I suppose, a blend of intellectual camaraderie and a shared, if somewhat reserved, romantic inclination. She was, undeniably, a brilliant mind in her own right, possessing a sharp intellect and a quiet determination. Our early years together were marked by the usual adjustments and compromises that accompany any marital union, albeit with the added intellectual spice of occasional late-night discussions about the nature of causality or the perplexing implications of Planck's constant. It was at times like living with a particularly thoughtful and articulate theoretical physicist, which, of course, she was. Our two sons, Hans Albert and Eduard, arrived in due course, adding a new dimension of joyous chaos to our lives. Children, I discovered, are rather like miniature, highly energetic, and occasionally illogical thought experiments. Their unbridled curiosity and their refreshingly unburdened perspective on the world served as a constant reminder that even the most complex scientific theories ultimately spring from a fundamental desire to understand the universe around us. Witnessing their early attempts to grasp the mechanics of a rolling ball or the trajectory of a thrown toy was, in its own way, as illuminating as deciphering the most intricate differential equation. One might even say it was a form of hands-on research into the fundamental principles of motion, albeit with significantly more unpredictable variables and the occasional requirement for immediate cleanup. Our apartment, while certainly not palatial, was a haven of sorts, a place where ideas could be freely exchanged and where the occasional, rather intense, scientific debate could unfold amidst the comforting backdrop of domestic life. The scent of coffee, the rustle of newspapers, the cheerful cacophony of children's play, these were the subtle yet indispensable elements that formed the backdrop to some of my most profound intellectual breakthroughs. It was a reminder that even the most abstract and seemingly detached scientific pursuits are inextricably linked to the very human experience of living, breathing, and occasionally wrestling with the particularly stubborn knot in a shoelace. My colleagues at the patent office, while perhaps not fully comprehending the magnitude of the theoretical earthquakes I was quietly precipitating in my spare time, were generally congenial. We shared anecdotes about particularly baffling patent applications, exchanged polite greetings, and occasionally commiserated over the seemingly endless supply of paperwork. It was a comfortable, if somewhat intellectually insulated existence. I was, in essence, leading a double life: patent clerk by day, clandestine revolutionary of physics by night. The universe, in its infinite wisdom, had chosen a rather unassuming stage for the performance of some of its most dramatic intellectual revelations. And all of this unfolded in the quiet, unassuming city of Bern, a place whose primary claim to fame, aside from its bears, was now, perhaps, its unexpected role in the redefinition of reality. The year 1908 marked a subtle but significant shift in my professional trajectory. The academic world, having slowly begun to digest the rather unsettling implications of my 1905 papers, finally extended a tentative invitation. I was appointed Privatdozent at the University of Bern, a rather modest academic stepping stone, but a stepping stone nonetheless. It meant I could now formally lecture, to articulate my ideas to a captive, albeit occasionally bewildered audience. It was a transition from the quiet contemplation of patent applications to the slightly more animated, though still largely dry, dissemination of theoretical physics. One might say I had moved from the meticulous examination of intellectual property to the rather more public and occasionally less appreciated exposition of intellectual audacity. My lectures, I suspect, were not always a model of pedagogical clarity, at least not in the conventional sense. My mind, perpetually engaged in a complex internal dialogue with the universe, often found it challenging to translate the elegant intricacies of abstract concepts into easily digestible morsels of information. I had a tendency to dive headfirst into the deeper philosophical implications of a given theory, often leaving my students struggling to keep pace with the rapidly evolving intellectual landscape. It was, perhaps, akin to attempting to teach someone to swim by throwing them into the deep end of a particularly turbulent ocean of ideas. Some, naturally, sank. Others, to their credit, managed to paddle valiantly, if somewhat haphazardly, towards a deeper understanding. The academic environment, while certainly more stimulating than the patent office, came with its own unique set of challenges. There were committees to attend, administrative minutiae to navigate, and the subtle yet persistent pressures of academic politics. It was a different kind of bureaucracy, perhaps less concerned with the precise wording of an invention, and more with the precise wording of a departmental budget. I found myself, at times, somewhat ill-suited to these more terrestrial concerns, my mind preferring the boundless expanse of the cosmos to the often confining parameters of an academic meeting agenda. Despite these minor inconveniences, the opportunity to engage with other physicists, to present my ideas in a more formal setting, was invaluable. The discussions, the debates, the occasional rather robust intellectual disagreements, these were the true currency of academic life. It was a chance to test my theories against the scrutiny of my peers, to refine my arguments, and to occasionally be reminded that even the most profound insights are subject to the rigors of critical examination. One might say it was a process of intellectual hardening, much like a blacksmith repeatedly hammering a piece of metal until it achieves the desired strength and resilience. The occasional sparks were merely an inevitable byproduct of the forging process. The academic ladder, once tentatively grasped, began to ascend with a certain, almost inevitable, momentum. From Bern, my trajectory led me to Zurich, then Prague, and eventually back to Zurich. Each move representing a new professorial appointment, a slightly grander title, and a progressively larger, if not always more enthusiastic, cohort of students. It was a series of intellectual migrations, each institution offering a subtly different intellectual climate. Much like a connoisseur of fine wines discerning the nuanced differences between vintages from various regions. My time in Prague, at the German university, was a period of intense focus on the burgeoning concept of general relativity. The special theory had illuminated the relationship between space and time for objects moving at constant velocities. But what about acceleration? What about gravity itself? These questions gnawed at me with the persistence of a particularly determined termite, slowly but surely undermining the comfortable foundations of classical physics. I suspected that gravity was not merely a force, as Newton had so elegantly described, but a manifestation of the curvature of space-time itself, much like the subtle depression a particularly heavy bowling ball creates on a stretched rubber sheet. It was an idea so outlandish, so utterly contrary to everyday experience, that it felt like suggesting that the very ground beneath one's feet was, in fact, a particularly elaborate illusion. The mathematical tools required to describe this intricate dance of gravity and space-time were formidable, requiring a deep dive into the arcane world of tensor calculus. It was a language of exquisite complexity, capable of expressing the universe's most profound truths with a terrifying precision. My collaborations with mathematicians, particularly Marcel Grossmann, became indispensable. He was the intellectual Sherpa, guiding me through the treacherous terrain of non-Euclidean geometry and the labyrinthine complexities of multidimensional spaces. Without his steady hand, I might have found myself hopelessly lost in a conceptual wilderness, much like an intrepid but geometrically challenged explorer attempting to navigate a particularly convoluted jungle. The process of developing general relativity was long and arduous, marked by numerous false starts, periods of profound frustration, and the occasional fleeting glimpse of an underlying elegance that spurred me onward. It was a journey into the unknown, a relentless pursuit of a theoretical white whale, with only the compass of mathematical consistency and the occasional flicker of intuitive insight to guide me. The stakes were, for me, immense. If successful, it would represent a complete reimagining of gravity, one of the fundamental forces shaping the cosmos. Failure, of course, would merely result in a slightly longer, somewhat more melancholic stroll home. The universe, it seemed, was not in the habit of revealing its deepest secrets without a considerable amount of intellectual persuasion. The culmination of my work on general relativity was met with a rather peculiar combination of quiet awe and profound confusion. The equations, intricate and elegant, painted a picture of a universe far more dynamic and interconnected than previously imagined. Space and time were no longer static backdrops against which events unfolded, but active participants capable of being warped and stretched by the presence of mass and energy. It was a concept so counterintuitive, so utterly divorced from everyday experience, that it felt like attempting to explain the nuances of quantum chromodynamics to a particularly bewildered garden gnome. The predicted effects of general relativity were subtle, almost imperceptible in the grand scheme of terrestrial affairs. The bending of light around massive objects, for instance, or the slight precession of Mercury's orbit, these were not phenomena that could be observed with the naked eye during a casual afternoon stroll. They required precise astronomical measurements, the kind of meticulous observation that would test the very limits of human ingenuity and telescopic technology. One might say it was a theory designed for the most discerning of cosmic detectives, those willing to pore over the minutiae of celestial mechanics to uncover the universe's most well-kept secrets. The scientific community, having now had a few years to grapple with the implications of special relativity, approached general relativity with a mixture of cautious optimism and a healthy dose of skepticism. There were no immediate parades in my honor, no spontaneous outbreaks of interpretive dance in the hallowed halls of academia. Instead, there was a period of rigorous scrutiny, of meticulous verification, of scientists around the world attempting to replicate the astronomical observations that would either validate or invalidate my rather audacious claims. It was a trial by fire, a scientific gauntlet that every groundbreaking theory must inevitably face, much like a particularly ambitious soufflé attempting to survive the critical gaze of a Michelin-starred chef. The ultimate validation came in 1919 during a total solar eclipse. Arthur Eddington, a British astronomer, led expeditions to observe the bending of starlight as it passed near the sun. The results, precisely matching the predictions of general relativity, sent ripples of astonished recognition throughout the scientific world. It was a moment of profound vindication, a clear and undeniable confirmation that the universe indeed behaved in the peculiar, elegant manner I had described. The headlines, predictably, were rather more dramatic than my own internal reaction, which was, I confess, a rather subdued nod of intellectual satisfaction. The scientific community had, it seemed, finally accepted the rather inconvenient truth that the universe was not merely a predictable clockwork mechanism, but a vast, cosmic trampoline, capable of profound and elegant distortions. My work, it appeared, was finally beginning to resonate, much like a particularly well-struck tuning fork. The fame that accompanied the confirmation of general relativity was, I must confess, a rather peculiar phenomenon. It descended upon me with the subtlety of a runaway train and the quiet dignity of a particularly flamboyant circus parade. Suddenly, I was no longer merely a theoretical physicist, engaged in the abstract contemplation of space-time. I was a public figure, a symbol, a rather unlikely celebrity whose disheveled hair and contemplative gaze became instantly recognizable. It was akin to discovering that one's meticulously crafted blueprint for a particularly efficient plumbing system had somehow been transformed into a national anthem. The press, with its insatiable appetite for novelty, transformed me into a caricature, a sort of benevolent, slightly absent-minded wizard of the cosmos. My pronouncements, even on topics entirely unrelated to physics, were sought out with an almost frantic intensity. I found myself being asked for opinions on everything from international politics to the proper method for brewing tea, inquiries for which I possessed precisely the same level of expertise as any other individual with a functional digestive system. It was a curious disjunction, this sudden elevation from quiet academic to public oracle. One might say I became a walking, talking intellectual Rorschach test, upon whom people projected their own hopes, fears, and fundamental misunderstandings about the universe. The constant demands on my time, the endless stream of invitations, the relentless pursuit by photographers. It was, at times, an exhausting circus. My personal life, previously a rather private affair, became a subject of public fascination, much like a particularly intriguing archaeological dig, whose every shovel of dirt is meticulously documented for mass consumption. The delicate balance between solitary contemplation and the demands of public life became an increasingly precarious tightrope walk, often performed with a distinct lack of proper balancing equipment. Despite the often absurd nature of this newfound celebrity, I recognized its utility. It provided a platform, a megaphone, through which I could advocate for causes I believed in, particularly peace and international cooperation. The world, having just emerged from the horrors of the Great War, was desperately in need of rational voices, of individuals willing to speak truth to power, even if that truth was occasionally obscured by the flashbulbs of intrusive photographers. So, I embraced the role, however reluctantly, understanding that the universe had, in its infinite irony, provided me with a peculiar and unexpected tool for influencing the course of human events. It was a testament to the unpredictable nature of fame, a phenomenon that, much like a particularly energetic subatomic particle, could appear in the most unexpected places and behave in the most baffling of ways. My personal life, under the glare of this unexpected public spotlight, continued its rather complex, often turbulent trajectory. My marriage to Mileva, already strained by years of intellectual divergence and the inherent pressures of raising a family amidst my relentless scientific pursuits, eventually dissolved. It was a painful, if ultimately necessary, separation, much like the gentle but firm disentanglement of two particularly stubborn mathematical variables that, while once intertwined, ultimately needed to pursue independent solutions. The equations of human relationships, I discovered, were often far more intractable than those governing the cosmos. I later married my cousin, Elsa Loewenthal. Elsa provided a different kind of companionship, one rooted in warmth, practicality, and a steadfast devotion. She was, in many ways, the grounding force, the steady gravitational pull that kept my often abstract mind tethered, however loosely, to the mundane realities of everyday life. Her patience with my eccentricities, her quiet understanding of my relentless pursuit of intellectual quarry, was a profound comfort. She managed the chaotic demands of my public life with a quiet efficiency, much like a particularly skilled orchestral conductor, attempting to bring order to a rather enthusiastic, yet occasionally discordant symphony. Our home, despite the constant intrusions of fame and the occasional demands of various international delegations, remained a sanctuary, a place where I could retreat into the comforting embrace of books, the quiet contemplation of unanswered questions, and the simple pleasures of domesticity. The sounds of family life, the murmur of conversation, the quiet rustle of pages being turned, these were the subtle, yet indispensable counterpoints to the grand cosmic narratives unfolding within my mind. It was a reminder that even the most abstract and seemingly detached scientific pursuits are inextricably linked to the very human experience of living, breathing, and occasionally arguing about the precise location of a misplaced pair of spectacles. The intellectual landscape, meanwhile, continued to evolve at a bewildering pace. The very quantum theory that my work on the photoelectric effect had helped to initiate was now revealing a universe far stranger, far more probabilistic than my own sensibilities preferred. The idea that reality existed as a mere collection of probabilities, that a particle could exist in multiple states simultaneously until observed, felt profoundly unsettling. It was akin to discovering that the very floor beneath your feet was not merely solid, but a shimmering, endlessly fluctuating tapestry of potential floorboards. I famously declared that God does not play dice with the universe, a statement that was, perhaps, less a theological pronouncement and more a heartfelt plea for a universe governed by elegant determinism rather than capricious chance. The universe, however, remained stubbornly indifferent to my aesthetic preferences. The rise of political extremism in Europe cast a long and increasingly ominous shadow over my existence, much like a particularly ill-tempered storm cloud determined to disrupt an otherwise pleasant intellectual picnic. As a Jew and a prominent pacifist, I found myself increasingly at odds with the virulent nationalism and anti-Semitism that swept across Germany in the 1930s. The once vibrant intellectual climate of my homeland began to curdle, replaced by an unsettling blend of fear, propaganda, and a chilling disregard for human decency. It was a stark reminder that even the most profound scientific insights are often powerless against the relentless tide of human irrationality. The decision to leave Germany was not made lightly. It was a wrenching departure from a place that, despite its flaws, had been the crucible of my intellectual development. But the atmosphere had become untenable, a suffocating blanket of intolerance that threatened not only intellectual freedom, but also the very lives of those who dared to dissent. One might say it was a forced intellectual migration, akin to a particularly sensitive plant being uprooted from its native soil and transplanted to a more hospitable climate, albeit under rather duress-filled circumstances. My destination was the United States, a land that, despite its own complexities and contradictions, offered the promise of intellectual refuge and a degree of freedom that was rapidly vanishing from Europe. Princeton, New Jersey, and the Institute for Advanced Study became my new intellectual home. It was a place designed for pure thought, a sanctuary for minds unburdened by the demands of undergraduate instruction or the mundane realities of departmental administration. Here I could pursue my relentless quest for a unified field theory, a grand overarching framework that would elegantly reconcile all the fundamental forces of the universe, much like a particularly ambitious tailor attempting to craft a single perfectly fitted garment for the entirety of cosmic existence. The intellectual atmosphere at Princeton was, for the most part, stimulating. I found myself in the company of brilliant minds, engaged in conversations that ranged from the sublime to the utterly arcane. However, my own scientific trajectory had increasingly diverged from the mainstream. While the world of physics was rapidly embracing the bewildering implications of quantum mechanics, I remained stubbornly committed to the pursuit of a deterministic, elegantly unified description of reality. It was a lonely path at times, like a solitary explorer attempting to navigate a vast, uncharted ocean, with only a compass of stubborn conviction to guide them, while the rest of the fleet had already set sail for a different, more probabilistic destination. The events of the Second World War cast a profound and unsettling shadow over my later years, a stark reminder that even the most abstract scientific discoveries possess the capacity for immense, and often terrifying, practical consequences. My own equation, E equals mc squared, a seemingly innocuous mathematical expression of the equivalence of mass and energy, suddenly found itself at the heart of the most destructive weapon ever conceived. It was a sobering realization, much like discovering that a particularly elegant sonnet you had composed had, through some unforeseen twist of fate, become the lyrical inspiration for a particularly devastating propaganda jingle. The universe, it seemed, had a rather dark sense of humor. My involvement, though indirect, in the development of the atomic bomb was a source of considerable personal anguish. I had signed a letter to President Roosevelt urging him to consider the possibility of a German atomic bomb and the necessity of American research into the matter. It was a decision born of fear and a desperate desire to prevent a greater evil, a strategic move on a chessboard where the pieces were nations and the stakes were unimaginable. The subsequent detonation of the bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, however, was a horrific testament to the destructive power unleashed by the very fundamental principles I had helped to uncover. It was a stark reminder that knowledge, in its purest form, is morally neutral. Its application, however, is deeply, profoundly entangled with the complex, often tragic choices of humanity. In the aftermath of the war, my voice became increasingly devoted to the cause of peace and disarmament. I believed, with a fervent conviction, that the very survival of humanity depended on our ability to transcend the tribal instincts of nationalism and embrace a global perspective. The atomic bomb had rendered conventional warfare obsolete. The only viable path forward was one of cooperation, mutual understanding, and the relentless pursuit of peaceful solutions. It was a message I articulated repeatedly, often with a certain weariness, much like a particularly persistent, yet increasingly hoarse prophet attempting to warn a rather distracted populace about an impending and entirely preventable catastrophe. My scientific work, meanwhile, continued, though my focus remained stubbornly fixed on the elusive goal of a unified field theory. The quantum revolution, with its inherent probabilistic nature, continued to expand its dominion, much to my lingering discomfort. I remained convinced that a deeper, more deterministic reality lay beneath the shimmering veil of quantum uncertainty, a grand, elegant theory that would encompass all the forces of nature in a single, beautiful mathematical framework. It was a lifelong quest, a relentless intellectual pursuit that consumed my final years, a journey into the deepest recesses of theoretical physics, often undertaken in quiet solitude, punctuated only by the gentle ticking of a clock and the distant murmur of a world grappling with the profound implications of its own technological prowess. The universe, it seemed, still held secrets, and I, for one, was not yet finished attempting to unravel them. The approach of the inevitable, that final, rather definitive punctuation mark at the end of every existence, was not a source of particular distress. I had, after all, spent a considerable portion of my life contemplating the grand narratives of the cosmos, the cyclical nature of energy, the relentless march of time. One becomes, eventually, rather accustomed to the concept of transitions, of the transformation of one state into another. It was simply the ultimate, rather irreversible, form of energy transfer, a cosmic accounting principle, if you will. My final days were spent in the quiet contemplation of scientific problems, wrestling with the same elusive questions that had haunted me for decades. The pursuit of a unified field theory remained my intellectual North Star, a distant, shimmering beacon that promised a final, elegant synthesis of all physical laws. It was a relentless, often frustrating, but ultimately deeply satisfying endeavor, much like attempting to complete a particularly intricate and eternally unfinished jigsaw puzzle. The pieces, though tantalizingly close, never quite yielded to a final, perfect configuration.